We're very happy to have Matt with us here tonight. It's a great opportunity to hear from a leader in the news industry and one who is leading a news organization that is thriving. It's also a news organization who hires many of our graduates, and we are very happy about that. The Journalism School is committed to preserving quality journalism and effective communication in the digital age, and I hope that we're doing well. We've just revamped our curriculum to make sure all of our students are ready for the industry they're entering. We're launching the Reese Phelps Digital News Project to experiment with news production and distribution and to study the audiences and the communities that form around news. Last year, we won the National Championship of College Journalism, finishing first overall in the Hearst Journalism Awards. For those who know your history, it's a little bit ironic because people refer to them as the Pulitzers of college journalism. The school has developed a very strong business journalism program. Professor Chris Rausch founded the Carolina Business News Initiative in 2002 that oversees educational initiatives for our students and for professional journalists who want to improve their ability to report and write about business journalism. Chris authors the popular Talking Biz News blog that is now syndicated by Forbes. And he was named the Scripps Howard Foundation Journalism Teacher of the Year last year. Chris was also able to convince tonight's speaker, Matt Winkler, to visit us and give us this lecture. Matt Winkler founded Bloomberg News with now New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg in 1990. In 20 years, Bloomberg has grown into a news organization with more than 2,300 editors, reporters, and multimedia professionals working in 146 bureaus in 72 countries. Matt co-authored Bloomberg by Bloomberg and authored The Bloomberg Way, a guide for reporters and editors. Between 1991 and 1994, he wrote the Capital Markets column for Forbes magazine. Prior to joining Bloomberg, Winkler reported for the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and Dow Jones News Services. He was born in New York City and graduated from Kenyon College, where he is a trustee. Matt is also a trustee of the Business Journalism Program of the City University of New York, a director of the International Center for Journalists, and a board member for the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Economic Club of New York. He chairs the board of the Knight Bagehot Fellowship Program at Columbia. He won the 2007 Gerald Loeb Award, Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award, the 2007 National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Lifetime Achievement Award, and the 2003 New York Financial Writers Association Elliott V. Bell Award. We are honored to welcome our distinguished guest. Please welcome him to Chapel Hill. Matt.
Thank you, Dean Folkerts and Professor Rausch, members of faculty, and all of you for having me here today. It is just a wonderful honor to be here. As soon as you walk in this building and you look up on the wall and you see Jefferson and Black and the First Amendment, and you feel right at home if you're a working journalist, and it's really kind of appropriate actually for the experience I want to share with you this afternoon in the context of what all of you do here so well. As Dean Folkerts and doubtless Professor Rausch have already said many times to you, you are exceptional in your focus, your purpose, your seriousness. You know, every day when I'm at work and I run into you, some of you, and probably more of you in years to come, it's really encouraging to see so much promise and so much dedication and commitment, and of course, integrity that you bring to the profession. And that's all a way of saying I think the best is yet to come. Here's hoping that some of the things that I might share with you this afternoon acknowledge that and demonstrate it. The Freedom of Information Act is a wonderful part of our democracy. As the comment from Jefferson, endures, it relates directly to what we do every day and how important it is, and that is to make sure that what people don't want us to know, we go find out and we share it as much as we can, as often as we can. And I just wanted to begin by sharing with you some very important words that are all about what we have done with the Freedom of Information Act. The first word is debt. There's probably no more important word right now in the world than that word debt. It is at the center of just about every issue, every event that is reported on. And before you think that's odd that I would say that, think about where the United States is today and what the concerns are with the United States, and it will invariably lead you to this subject and word called debt. There's another word that's very important here called derivatives. And this is a word that most people aren't quite familiar with still, but it lies at the center of what has become the great unraveling, and some have dubbed the Great Recession. Another two words that go together, toxic debt, and then some very familiar words to you, housing and the economy. Housing and the economy. So where does this story begin? It begins in the 90s, one of the best decades for growth, expansion, innovation. And a big part of that innovation started on Wall Street, where for the first time, some of the best and brightest people coming out of elite institutions of learning decided they were going to make their way, their careers, their fortune. And the fortune that they made was literally made from debt, all kinds of debt. In the early 90s, just about every firm on Wall Street was cutting up, slicing, dicing your mortgage and mine, and commercial real estate, residential real estate, everything that was a debt instrument, a bond, became part of a new kind of security, something synthetic, something that would be called a derivative. And the derivatives that mushroomed out of Wall Street became a great American export because they offered higher yields. What had been going on in the 90s is a wonderful convergence. The great budget deficit that everybody fretted about early in the decade then was narrowing to the point where it would become a surplus by the time the 21st century would begin. And yields on U.S. Treasury bonds, the benchmark, from a peak of 15% for debt instruments of 30 years would come all the way down to 4%, even 3%. And so investors who were searching for yield found exactly what they were looking for, or thought what they were looking for, in the form of these derivative securities, which were packaged from real estate. Some of the real estate that went into these derivatives that the world was happily consuming and that Wall Street was happily selling at a wonderful and lucrative profit were what were known as subprime mortgages. And these subprime mortgages, as the title implies, were something less than creditworthy. That's why they were called subprime. But Wall Street had a wonderful way of taking these subprime securities from these subprime mortgages and mixing them with a little treasuries and other higher rated debt instruments so that the cocktail that came out was rated AAA, and everybody rushed to consume it. And so it went on and on. And by the time we were in the 21st century, a massive industry had been created from these derivatives because of the world's appetite for yield and because of so many brilliant financiers who were able to put them all together. And while some of this story was reported, at least the creation around 2007, at the height of the exuberance over a debt market that had expanded exponentially from practically nothing in 1989 to trillions of dollars by the more than halfway point in the new decade. There started to be cracks in the whole system. Hedge funds that had gobbled up these securities and sold them suddenly discovered that the appetite for these securities was diminishing. And once that became clear, it set off more and more of a scramble for safer securities and less risk. And in the summer of 2007, first a hedge fund operated by Bear Stearns declined to return money to its investors. And then later that summer in August, a big French bank, BNP Paribas, also declined to return money. And suddenly the shadow market of finance had taken over the real market of finance. And the European Central Bank was suddenly prompted to do an unprecedented one-day rescue of the money market. And then a month later, the Federal Reserve followed with something similar. And so by the fall of 2007, it was becoming clear that the financial system as we know it was starting to buckle. And things that people thought couldn't happen here were now happening. And that's where our story really begins. And it begins with a intrepid reporter who didn't know much about debt when he started the beat. And I'm talking about a Bloomberg reporter, Mark Pittman. Mark would be instantly recognizable in any great story about fearless journalists. Born in Kansas, he made much of his career as a reporter covering state and local government, and was at the Albany Times Union in Albany, New York, before he came to Bloomberg. I don't think he would know a bond if it bit him in the nose. But by the time he had 4 or 5 years at Bloomberg, he was writing about the government bond market, the corporate bond market, and corporate finance. And one of the wonderful things about Mark Pittman, which all of you can appreciate, is that the only thing he was interested in was getting the story. That's it. That's all he cared about. He was a big bear of a man. He couldn't resist schmoozing with anybody who might pass on a tip or two. He finds himself in the summer of 2007 covering this unraveling of the debt market. And at the center of the crisis is the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is the agent of the US Treasury. And it's the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that every day is dealing with other central banks around the world and all the banks in the United States to make sure that our money clears as it's supposed to and everybody gets paid on time and gets what they're due. And it was around the fall of 2007 that the Federal Reserve started to do some things that never in its history it had done. The Federal Reserve was chartered in 1913. It was created on the model of the great European central banks, all of which, by the way, had a tradition of operating secretly, away from the public. And the Fed, while it was much more democratic than its European predecessors, it was still, in 2007, an opaque institution, and to a great extent it remains so. So Mark Pittman finds himself writing about markets in upheaval. It was at this point that suddenly credit collapsed and people were unable to get loans, mortgages. Commercial institutions that had been dealing with each other suddenly were unable to complete their transactions, and the Fed had to step in the middle of this. And the way it went about doing so is it increasingly started entering the market of shadow finance, the market of derivatives, not because it wanted to, not because it was chartered to do so, but because it felt compelled to. And over the next 2 years, the Fed would become steeped in all kinds of debt instruments that have no transparency, have no compatibility with US government securities, whether they are 3-month bills or 10-year notes or 30-year bonds. And in the course of doing things that had never been done before, the Fed's balance sheet suddenly ballooned from less than $1 trillion to several $1 trillion. And that's a lot of money. And all of this happened without so much as a acknowledgement, disclosure, what is going on here. Now, why is this important? Because within a 10-month period from the spring of 2007 through, 2008 through the rest of the year, the US government, which is us, you and me, taxpayers, would arrange unprecedented bailouts of the very same institutions on Wall Street that created this toxic debt. So taxpayer money is suddenly being used in extraordinary ways to rescue these financial institutions. Now, all in the name of rescuing the financial system and for the better of our economy, but this was a crisis the likes of which none of us had seen in our lifetime. One had to go back to the Great Depression in the 30s to find anything remotely comparable to what we were witnessing in the last 3 months of 2007 and all through 2008. And all of this was done in the name of the US taxpayer. All of this was done with taxpayer dollars. And all of this was, for all intents and purposes, opaque. There is nothing that any of us would know from day to day exactly what the Fed was doing with your money and mine to rescue these institutions. Now, in all fairness, we can say with some certainty that the Fed did a brilliant job. And we can say that the leaders who were immersed in this crisis, all with great intentions, did not only the best that they could do, but probably prevented the United States economy from going into a depression and probably helped the rest of the world as well. Having said all that, it still remains unclear what exactly the Fed did, why it did what it did, and it does have a responsibility to disclose these things because that is, in fact, part of the charter of the Fed, and it's what the U.S. government requires of all of its departments, all of its agencies. So in the course of writing about the markets unraveling, Mark Pittman is finding the Fed is not cooperating in disclosing any of this information, nor is the Treasury for that matter. And so that led to a rather routine conversation in our newsroom. Why shouldn't we, since this should be a matter of public record, sue the Fed under the Freedom of Information Act and seek these records of what the Fed did, especially with debt that is not transparent, debt that is not part of the record every day of the market, the real market. For several months, our request went unanswered, and then the Fed succinctly, politely declined to release any of these records. So we went to court. And in court, we argued that it's a matter of public record, what the Fed does with taxpayer money, and there is no reason why any of this should be withheld from the public, and it's a matter of public interest. Not only that, the market arguably has a right to know what is going on behind the curtain. The Fed argued that to disclose any of this might trigger a panic, that if any of the less than solvent institutions were disclosed, that there would be a series of runs at other financial institutions, we'd have a panic, and therefore prudence dictated that none of this be disclosed. The first court where we appeared said there was absolutely no evidence from the Fed to prove that assertion, and without evidence, it couldn't agree, and so Bloomberg prevailed. The Fed appealed, and the second time we went to court, and again the court decided in Bloomberg's favor. And then the third time the Fed appealed most recently, and the court again said there is no evidence to suggest that something extraordinary would unsettle the markets or otherwise injure the public. So that's where we are now, and it looks as if that this case will go to the Supreme Court. If it doesn't, it will be fortunately, it will be a matter of routine for us to just get all of these records because these rulings would allow us to seize them. I would just say parenthetically, here are some things we have learned in the 3 years since we took up this story and since we pursued this topic using our journalism and the wonderful U.S. Constitution as our guide. We were able to go through some records that were released belatedly, and the Fed, by the way, has acknowledged that it needs to become more open, and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke has said as much in several appearances before Congress in his testimony. And what we have learned is this, is that at the height of the crisis in 2008, just a couple months after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, which was the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history, that the Fed and the Treasury weren't as complete in their testimony about what was unfolding as they might have been. Now, giving them the benefit of the doubt, these events don't require people to divulge everything they know. They just must answer the questions that are directed at them. But what we have learned since from some of the records that have been released is that, in fact, in 2008, what the U.S. government was buying, owning, would become classified as less than creditworthy securities, securities that would be described as illiquid, securities that in the jargon of the profession would be described as toxic debt. So it did happen that in the height of the crisis, your money and mine was invested in toxic debt securities. And that was because we needed to rescue the financial system. What's the takeaway from all this? I think the reason why I said the best is yet to come for all of you, all of us in our profession, the reason why I think that's so is because this is a subject that isn't going to go away. This is a subject that is as important as any. It isn't just at the federal level. State and local governments routinely borrow. State and local governments routinely borrow in ways that are opaque. State and local governments do financing with instruments that are now classified as toxic. There have been several examples, not just the collapse of major securities firms on Wall Street because of toxic debt, but also cities, towns, municipalities that have also imploded because of their Faustian bargains with the shadow market of finance. Jefferson County, Alabama, Birmingham is a great example of that. Harvard University did a 30-year interest rate swap that was so complicated that at the height of the financial crisis, even a place like Harvard with the biggest endowment in higher education, it had a cash squeeze. It had to terminate the interest rate swap, which is a derivative, and it had to pay a penalty of $1 billion. So these are very real issues that need to be dealt with. And if we don't deal with them as reporters, I'm afraid no one else will. And that is the challenge. I hope that's the inspiration too. That's what I mean by our best days are ahead of us, because we've got our work cut out for us. And none of this is in vain, and all of it is something that helps make our markets safer and more secure. And I dare say, if it weren't for the opportunity that our reporting allows us, we would not be in the place that we are today. So I thank you for indulging me, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
We have some questions for Mr. Winkler. It's a little bright up here, so there's one over here, and there's one back here somewhere next.
If you go back to 2005 or 2004, can you see any merit in derivatives? And what's the relationship between the collapse of the financial market and the inability to produce jobs in the economy right now?
Okay, that's a great question. First, if you go back to 2005, could you say there's any value in derivatives? That's the first part. And then what's the connection with all of this sophisticated finance and the job market today, which is, by the way, about as bad as it's been in the past 35 years? The first part of your question, which is derivatives in 2005. The former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, once said about derivatives, they are benign. And he was speaking from a perspective that said, you know, free markets are the best way to allow the economy to prosper. Built into that prosperity are periods of creative destruction. So even if derivatives are occasionally destructive, ultimately they are benign. And that was his perspective. And he made that point over and over again while he was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 90s. It's appropriate to say that since then, since he left the Fed, he's changed his mind about that. Now, another individual who is also arguably an authority on this subject and is considered by some the world's greatest investor, Warren Buffett, from Nebraska, referred to derivatives as financial instruments of mass destruction. Here's where what we know is definitive. Unless things are transparent to all concerned, there's a great risk of hazard, all kinds of hazard. And the issue with derivatives has since become, and the Obama administration is attempting to deal with this, the SEC is attempting to deal with this, is to say if they're going to be derivatives, they should become recognizable, they should be on an exchange, they should be transparent. And what we know can't hurt us as much as what we don't know. And it's what we don't know that will kill us. That was the problem with derivatives. We didn't know what they were. And that still is the problem, by the way, because to this day, every synthetic security that isn't listed on an exchange, that isn't transparent, is out of Alice in Wonderland. It could be whatever anybody wants it to be at any given moment because it isn't transparent. Now, what's the connection with jobs? It is true that so many of our vital resources were devoted to creating these financial instruments that there certainly was an opportunity cost in the 25 years that Wall Street was consumed with making money out of money. There's a bit of alchemy in some of that, as opposed to making things, all kinds of things. Now, this wonderful period of innovation on Wall Street actually coincided with a wonderful period of innovation with technology. And so, you know, the 20 years leading up to, say, 2001 was a wonderful period of very dynamic, a very dynamic economy, but there were two sides of it. There was the information technology part, which was creating jobs, and there was the financial part, which, while it created jobs on finance, it's hard to argue or see how it helped American industry in any way, how it helped American industry get stronger. There are people who will say, because of the creative financing techniques on Wall Street, companies were able to save money because they were able to lower their borrowing costs. That is a bit of a debate. It hasn't been resolved yet, but suffice it to say that the calamity, the financial calamity that the toxic debt explosion incited is very much reflected in the unemployment figures that we have today. And here's why. The housing market was built on leverage. And the leverage came from these toxic securities. The housing market was the biggest single part of the American economy. It is still mired in the doldrums. It is still barely recovering from where it was, you know, just a few months ago. There has not been a noticeable recovery. Since the housing market is the biggest part of the American economy, it has affected jobs. What kind of jobs? Construction jobs, every kind of job that's related to building things, especially commercial and residential real estate. So you can see the connection right there, and it's going to be a long while, according to all of the reporting that we've done to date, before you see the housing market rebound to anything like where it was, and therefore you're not going to see construction come back to the extent that it has. So the jobs that are missing are going to have to come from somewhere else in the meantime, if they're going to come from anywhere.
Okay, question. I saw one back here somewhere earlier. A room full of journalism students and no question?
Here.
With due respect to Bloomberg News, did Bloomberg anticipate the event of 7 and 8? Did it communicate to its constituents? And if not, why not?
Okay, the question is, was this credit collapse evident to us at Bloomberg News, and did we report it before? And the answer to that question is yes, we did. We have a monthly magazine devoted to finance, and the monthly magazine is titled Bloomberg Markets. And the early spring issue of Bloomberg Markets magazine, I think it was the May issue of Bloomberg Markets magazine, the entire issue introduced to the world, I think there's no record of it beforehand, those two words, toxic debt. And the entire issue of the magazine, all of the stories were run on Bloomberg News as well, and some of them, by the way, appeared in newspapers and so on, deconstructed the mortgage market in the United States to show how subprime mortgages got packaged with other kinds of debt instruments, carved up and then sold around the world, how housing was bought and sold on the basis of the loans that were made tied to the subprime mortgages, and that all of this was extremely hazardous, hence the word toxic debt, the term toxic debt, and it was unsustainable. So we did see it coming, and we did try to outline why it was so pernicious. And by the way, that reporting of ours in the early period of 2007 coincided with several government officials saying at the time that the subprime mortgage crisis, because it was a crisis at that point, was containable, and they actually used that word contained. If you go back to the record of 2007 and see how many times Ben Bernanke said contained, how many times the CEOs on Wall Street used that word contained, how often Hank Paulson, who was then the Treasury Secretary, said contained, and we were saying there's no evidence to say it's contained because you think of it this way, suppose you're allergic to anchovies, but you love Greek salad minus the anchovies, and I put some anchovies in the salad and I mix it all up, and there's no way for you to know if I did it or not. But I serve it to you, and because you're allergic, you get poisoned. And that's kind of what happened with all that subprime debt. It was the anchovy in the Greek salad. The Greek salad was consumed all over the world, and unfortunately it was not a disaster that could be contained.
Got time for a couple more questions. Right here.
I don't know if it's a little off topic, but kind of along the lines of what you've been talking about today. Do you have any thoughts on the possible exceptions to the SEC regarding the Freedom of Information Act that they're talking about passing?
We're against. We find it incredible that the SEC, of all institutions, which is meant to protect investors from all the hazards of the financial markets, that it itself would be somehow exempt from disclosing what it's up to as it's trying to protect investors. It exists solely for the purpose of protecting the public. So why does it have anything to hide in the course of doing so? We can't figure that one out.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.